Good evening. Hi. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Byron, and I have the honor of being the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Nixon Library. We have an excellent program in store for all of you this evening, but I'd like to begin by welcoming a few special guests, starting with Sandy Quinn, a member of the Board of Directors and former president of the Richard Nixon Foundation. I'd also like to recognize a significant supporter who is key to the Foundation's ongoing efforts to reacquaint people with American civics. That is Mike Crow. Thank you, Mike. You've been a longtime supporter. Thank you. So how many of you in the room are members of the Nixon Foundation? Well, that's okay. I want to thank all of you who raised your hand. And I want to encourage all of you who did not to consider joining. It's an annual membership program to support and fund and make possible the Distinguished Speaker Series programs like that tonight, as well as all kinds of foundation educational exhibits and programs. So I invite you to check us out online at nixonfoundation.org. I also want to invite you all, and all of those watching live on YouTube and on X tonight, to visit and experience our just opened new special exhibition called The Ancient World, which takes you back 5,000 years in history and displays more than 70 ancient objects of antiquity from Egyptian, Israeli, and Persian civilizations. So that's open right now, and that will be on display through March of 2025. This evening, we are very pleased to welcome former National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, who holds the Fawad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellowship at the Hoover Institution. General McMaster served as a U.S. Army officer for 34 years. He was an armored cavalry commander in the Persian Gulf War, where his cavalry troop took part in the last great tank battle of the 20th century. He would go on to serve in both the Afghanistan War and the Iraq War, and he retired as a lieutenant general in 2018. General McMaster was appointed the 25th National Security Advisor to the President, a position that he held from 2017 to 2018, serving President Trump. During his West Wing tenure, he championed a major overhaul of America's national security strategy to more pointedly counter rising threats abroad. He is the author of the new book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House, which is his first memoir. He is additionally the author of Dereliction of Duty, widely acknowledged as a seminal work on the Vietnam War, and one that continues to be read and studied. This evening's program is being co-presented with Chapman University's Presidential Studies program. General McMaster will have a conversation this evening on stage with Dr. Luke Nichter, who holds the James H. Cavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman and is director of the Presidential Studies program. Dr. Nichter is an historian of the post-war 20th century America with an emphasis on the 1960s and 1970s. He is the author or editor of 8 books, including his most recent, entitled The Year That Broke Politics: Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968, which was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General H.R. McMaster and Dr. Luke Nichter.
General, because it has my name right there, just in case. In case I get confused, you know. Good to see everybody.
Well, welcome. I think I'd like to dive in by asking the same question I asked Sarah Huckabee Sanders, now Governor Sanders, when she visited here in 2019. Some of you might remember that event. I commented how much the Trump administration seemed to be under attack, not only from predictable places like the political opposition, but many in the national media, and even within the Republican Party. I asked how she managed to stay focused in the face of such attacks. Her answer, a lot of Jesus and a little bourbon. So General McMaster, what was your secret weapon for survival?
Hey, well, thanks, Luke, and thanks for the privilege of being with you. I really am a big admirer of your work as an historian, and a real privilege to be here. Hey, so, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to the awesome Nixon Library and Foundation, too. So, hey, I really thought it was a privilege every day to serve, and I hope that's the tone that comes through the book. I mean, I'd served in the Army for 33 years when I got that unexpected call to go to Mar-a-Lago to interview for the job, and I had served 6 commanders-in-chief, and so, I tried to regard all of the kind of infighting that, is one of the themes. It is entitled At War with Ourselves, right? And that alludes to, the at-war aspect of inside of the administration, but also in our society and how vitriolic our partisan political discourse has become. But, I just tried to block out the noise and focus on the mission to do my job. And, there are a lot of arduous circumstances that I've been in combat, and that's how you cope, with those difficult circumstances, is with kind of a bit of a dose of stoicism, and what we learned from Aristotle, focus on what you can control, and you can get a lot done, and try to ignore the rest as best as you can.
As I was preparing for tonight, it occurred to me that you've seen this room many times. Not just this actual room, but the real East Room in the White House. For those of us who've never had a regular commute to the West Wing, set the scene a little. What's it like? Does the sense of awe ever wear off?
Yeah, I think the sense of awe never really wears off because of the history of the place and because of the importance of where the president works and where the president lives. And one of the things that I loved doing when I was a national security advisor is oftentimes after hours, friends and family would meet me at the White House, and I would do these after hours tours. I tell the story of doing one of these with my dear friend, Father Paul Hurley, who's a Catholic priest, and he was a major general as the chief of chaplains for the Army. And so my wife, Katie, and I were walking through the residence. The president was at Mar-a-Lago, and we're looking for light switches to turn on the lights for the Christmas trees and everything on Christmas Eve. So you do have a sense of it's a privilege to serve there. You want to share that with others. And it's really a sense of responsibility. And I think what you should recognize is, hey, the job you're in is much bigger than any one person, and so it's your job to to help the president advance and protect American interests, and I thought it was a privilege every day. And the history of the place is fantastic. My Secret Service were great. They knew a lot of the details and anecdotes about each of the rooms. And being able to tell some of the backstories about some of the portraits and the personalities, and so it was a real privilege to do it every day.
Speaking of the West Wing, I've heard Ambassador Robert O'Brien here in this room on more than one occasion say that one of the best things National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger did for his successors was to steal that corner office from the White House Chief of Staff. I note in your book how many of your predecessors you consulted when you took the job. What were some of the most important things you gained from them besides a great office?
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks, Luke. I really, I think that exploring history, learning from others, it's kind of an exercise in humility, right? You're not the first person who had that job. It's a job with such a broad scope of responsibility that nobody's really completely prepared for that. So I think it would be kind of ignorant to think, well, I couldn't learn from the experiences of others. So I made it a point, and I write about this in the book, in the first few weeks on the job, to consult every living national security advisor with either a phone call or a personal visit, ask them their experience and ask them their advice for how I could best discharge my duties and responsibilities. And I got a lot of really great advice, Henry Kissinger, for example, he reminded me, what was important to know is that the National Security Advisor is the only person in the national security and foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. He also told me that friction and tension between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State is also not impressive. I knew that from my own study of the presidency and of the National Security Council and so forth about Vietnam, but also having taught a course on Korean Vietnam and so forth. So I knew that didn't surprise me, but Kissinger reminded me, he said, never has the relationship between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State been better than since when I held both positions. You know? And he had a great sense of humor. He really did have a great sense of humor. He wrote me a letter after our first meeting. He came to see me. It was my second full day on the job. And he had, in preparation for meeting me, he had read Dereliction of Duty, which he had not read before. And he said he was glad that his historian was in the job. We had a great conversation about the greatest challenges we're facing around the world and so forth. But the first line of his letter, which I'm going to have to frame and put up in our house, is, "You are walking a tightrope with chasms on both sides." Is what I thought. Okay, well, and it turned out to be an apt metaphor for my 13 months. So each of them stressed different aspects of the job. Zbigniew-Brzezinski and I had a long conversation. We were supposed to talk for half an hour, and we talked for a full hour at least. And it was just before he passed away. Condoleezza Rice gave me some great advice, about what she saw as the biggest challenges in the world and the degree to which the Obama administration had created some vacuums that were bound to be filled by our adversaries, and that there were some important correctives to be made to previous unwise policies. Many of them gave me advice on just practical approaches to the job, tactics for coordinating and integrating efforts, getting people together. Stephen Hadley, for example, for George W. Bush, he had a chips and salsa meeting, and some met for lunch or breakfast and so forth, with the key cabinet officials. But it was all really useful and practical, because when I first started the job, I didn't live in Washington, so Katie wasn't there and nobody was there to feed me or anything, So the job was pretty intense. So a few days, I would think, wow, gee, I wonder what I should order for lunch, and it was like 5:30 p.m. Because the day just goes by super fast. And I went to Colin Powell's house because Colin Powell, of course, not a good relationship with President Trump, So he said, you should just come to my house, which I did for lunch, and I ate like everything in sight. I ate, and he's like, man, you need to come over here more often because nobody's feeding you. So they were all very gracious to me. I talked to not only Republicans, I talked to Republicans, Democrats, it was I think important to do. And we held little meetings, dinners over the course of time there as well. So anyway, it was really beneficial to me in a number of ways.
I was surprised to learn in the book, among the many things that I learned, that your time as National Security Advisor was actually your first tour of duty in Washington. So my question is, how did you manage to avoid it for so long? And how would you describe it as a place to work for those who have not had the experience?
Yeah, I'd never even been assigned to the Pentagon. I had done some short temporary duty at the Pentagon, but I'd never been assigned to Washington. But I had the opportunity to study it from a historical perspective, so I felt that was very beneficial to me. But I avoided it because I was either teaching history at West Point or going to grad school, or I was in combat units or in combat headquarters abroad. And of course, for so many years, I mean, from after 9/11, as so many of us in the armed forces were, I spent the bulk of my time in Afghanistan and Iraq in those years.
Well, in addition to your other credentials, you are also a historian with a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. When did your passion for history begin?
It began when I was a little kid. My mom was a fantastic teacher, really fantastic teacher, and she taught in the Philadelphia School District for 34 years or something. I mean, a long time, over 3 decades, and she instilled in my sister and me just an interest in history. And I grew up in the city of Philadelphia. What a better place, home of the Eagles. Any Eagles fans tomorrow night? Packers. They're looking good this year. So I grew up in Philadelphia, so I had a real sense for the history of our country, and especially the founding, and what a privilege and unique, a unique benefit to all of us to live in this great country that's founded on on the principles of freedom and liberty. And so on vacations, summer vacations, we would go to like the Gettysburg battlefield, or Yorktown, the Yorktown battlefield. And so from a very young age, I read as much history as I could, much of it military history. And I was drawn to the military from like my earliest memory. My father also got me interested in the military. He was a reserve officer back when infantry units were still in the Army Reserve, and he was the first sergeant for an infantry company in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, and then got a direct commission during the Vietnam War and was the company commander of that same company. And so I saw him. I didn't live a military life of a military child and move around a lot, but I was aware of my dad's service, his service in the Korean War, and I always wanted to be a member of, the armed forces. I always wanted to be a soldier and to be able to build teams in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. To be part of a mission bigger than yourself. And when I married Katie, I told her I was probably going to get out of the Army after 5 years. At my retirement kind of roast, she said, "Thank you for the bonus 29." Because once I was in, I just found it to be so rewarding, and just kept going to the next assignment.
Is there a time in the White House that comes to mind in which a knowledge of history was useful and it made a difference in terms of what you were trying to achieve?
Yeah, every single day, history made a difference for me. And so I tell the story in the book. I was walking down, appropriately enough, Walnut Street in Philadelphia, on my way to the Foreign Policy Research Institute on the Friday before President's Day weekend. And I was briefing out a study that I had commissioned. My job at the time was to design the future Army. And as part of that job, I had commissioned an interdisciplinary study, including with historians, but with scientists, physicists, military experts of various kinds, to look at what we were calling Russian New Generation Warfare, with an emphasis on Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but also other forms of Russian aggression designed to accomplish the Kremlin's objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted response against that aggression. So my phone rings. It's a partially blocked Washington, D.C. number. I answer the phone. It's the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House. She says, "Hey, can you come to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow to interview for the job as National Security Advisor?" I wound up going that Sunday, interview with President Trump. He held me over for a second interview, hired me on Monday of President's Day. I flew back on Air Force One with him to Washington, but I didn't live in Washington. So they had aircraft fly me back to my home in Tidewater, Virginia, Marine Osprey aircraft. I packed a bag, got back on the aircraft the next day, and I started work on Tuesday. So not a lot of notice or preparation time. But what I had is the great gift of being able to study history. And I know Luke appreciates this better than anybody, understanding in detail from my research how and why Vietnam became an American war, and being able to be critical from a historian's perspective of a fundamentally flawed national security decision-making and policy-making process in the Lyndon Johnson administration, really gave me the opportunity to at least not make the same mistakes when I got into the White House. So on my first day, which is that kind of surreal feeling, okay, all right, now, Mr. Smarty Pants, historian, you're now in charge. You're in charge of the process that you criticize as a historian. So I took out a legal pad and I wrote down the 5 lessons that I think I had learned from reading, researching, writing about how and why Vietnam became an American war. The first of these were that there wasn't enough time being spent thinking about the nature of the challenges that they faced, the nature of the challenge in Vietnam. The second was, hey, there weren't any clear objectives. In fact, McGeorge Bundy had said, oh, it's better not to have an objective in Vietnam. That way, if we don't accomplish it, it'll give the president, quote, more flexibility in the domestic political arena. The third big lesson was the assumptions that underpin the strategy and policy were fundamentally flawed, but because they were implicit, they were never challenged. The fourth key lesson was they didn't provide President Johnson multiple options. They presented the option he wanted because Lyndon Johnson saw Vietnam principally as a danger to his domestic priorities of getting elected in his own right in 1964. Remember, President Kennedy had been assassinated in November of 1963, And then he wanted to pass the Great Society legislation in 1965. And because he saw Vietnam principally as a danger to those objectives, he wanted a strategy for Vietnam that would allow him to avoid a difficult decision, a decision that might alienate some of the key constituencies on which those agendas depended. And so his advisors obliged him, right? And one of his advisors even said, hey, to maintain my influence with the president, I had to give him the answer he wanted. Well, of course, that begs the question, what the heck good is your influence anyway, if you're just going to tell the president what he or she wants to hear? And then finally, I endeavored to insulate the development of options in national security, from partisan political considerations that might taint the development of those options. And we put into place, I described this in more detail in the book, about the procedures we put in place, the process we put in place to avoid at least making those same mistakes.
Well, here we are talking about foreign policy in the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, so I've got to ask you a question about our 37th president. Academics talk about U.S. foreign policy in terms of grand strategy. That uppermost is a set of ideals that link the diplomatic initiatives of an administration. It's an oversimplification, but the Nixon Doctrine is basically about reducing tensions with Russia and China, building up a kind of regional powers like Japan and Iran as a kind of Cold War middle management, and ending an unpopular war while not letting the nation slip into isolationism. At the same time, on his White House tapes, President Nixon spends a lot of time simply reacting to challenges of the day. Based on your experience, is foreign policy guided more by grand strategy or by how you react to challenges that pop up?
Yeah. Well, I think it should be guided by grand strategy, because if you're always reacting, you're never going to seize the initiative. You're never going to be able to really bend or shape the balance of power in favor of the United States and our allies. So I had found that the Obama administration had been very tactical in their focus on the NSC staff. And in fact, the Obama administration had centralized a lot of decision-making, normally which would reside authorities in the departments and agencies within the White House. And so one of the first things I did is to try to get us to think more strategically, to think longer term. And in my first full day on the job, I had an all-hands meeting with all the members of the NSC staff. And I put up a draft vision for the organization, that we would be a valued, trusted, and strategic organization. An organization that had the trust of the president, obviously, but the trust of departments and agencies and of our allies and partners. And by the word strategic, what I meant, we have to get out of the business of tactical decision-making in the White House. Oftentimes, what I had found is those who centralize control at a higher level, they do so because there's no clear concept that gives subordinate organizations, or departments and agencies in this case, the ability to take the initiative and to understand how what they're doing with their assets, with their resources, with their programs, their initiatives, their operations is contributing to that overarching concept. So after inventorying all those authorities that were centralized, one example was that they had to request an exception for any more than 3 helicopters to be in Syria. Like, why is that? So I prepared decision memoranda for the president to devolve all those back down. They had to request permission to sail through the South China Sea. Hey, well, like last time I checked, China doesn't own the ocean, right? Why are we requesting permission? Just sail through the South China Sea, whatever you want, Pentagon. So we devolved these back into the departments and agencies. But then, of course, we were in a race, kind of, because with the new administration, to try to put into place the president's policies and strategies to help him really try to determine what his own agenda was going to be from a foreign policy perspective, and then to turn, the ship of state, in many cases, and I describe this in the book, were really massive shifts in U.S. foreign policy. So to do that, we put in a process of trying to frame our biggest challenges. That first day on the job, I also wrote out 16 first-order challenges to national security that we should focus on as priorities. And some of these were all in the form of a problem statement, right? Some were short, none of these were easy, but some were short. How to stabilize Iraq and ensure that Iraq is not aligned with Iran. Okay, we need to convene a framing session on that. We need a policy and strategy in place for that. Some were longer and maybe even more consequential, like how to prevent China from establishing exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region and creating new spheres of influence that allow the Chinese Communist Party leadership to rewrite the rules of international discourse in a way that disfavors the United States and favors their authoritarian form of governance and their statist mercantilist economic model. So, I mean, that's a big problem. I mean, that's top priority, right? How to ensure that North Korea is not a threat to its neighbors, the United States, and the world, you know? So, you know, shorter formulation, difficult problem. And so what we did is we began to schedule a principal small group framing session around each of these over many weeks. We had less than one meeting a week here. And we built like a 5-page paper that was a framing document that didn't talk at all about what we're gonna do about these, but just do we understand the character of this challenge. And so the first paragraph is just the nature of the challenge. Then we listed the vital interests that were at stake, the goals and objectives, the assumptions, and then we listed the obstacles to progress and opportunities. And then we got the cabinet together, the secretaries of state and defense, the heads of intel agencies, and I started the meeting always really right on time, you know. The purpose of this meeting is to provide principals feedback and to modify the framing of this national security challenge, and then in the second part of the meeting, to solicit principals' ideas about how to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to overcome the obstacles to progress and take advantage of the opportunities, make progress toward those goals and objectives. What that did is it gave top-down guidance to the assistant secretary level, which is called the Policy Coordinating Committee. Not to get into too much of this detail, probably, how long is he gonna talk about this stuff? But anyway, it goes Policy Coordinating Committee, Deputies Committee, Principals Committee. Usually it's a bottom-up process. And we know what happens with bottom-up processes, right? You get satisficing behavior, lowest common denominator, and that's why so many of the policy papers that I read that were on the receiving end in places like Kabul and Baghdad made no sense to me. They were policy pablum, right? Full of words like robust, you know, and guardrails, and like, what are you talking about? So we focused on really, you know, short declarative sentences and a solid framework for each of these policies, and I think it made a big difference. And if you want to see an example of this, you can look to the unclassified national security strategy that was published in December of 2017, which I think it stands the test of time. I mean, if you read it today, you might not like some of the phrasing in it if you're not an American first person, you know, or a Trump supporter, but if you just ignore that, you know, and read the substance, read the argument of that national security strategy, I think it's persuasive.
I'd like to ask you a question about leadership, and specifically how you've adapted to the leadership styles of various commanding officers in your career. You know, one thing I think about in terms of a similarity, I think about a similarity between General Dwight Eisenhower and Donald Trump, in a sense, that neither had been a political leader before reaching the White House, and both were elected, arguably because being an outsider was considered a strength at their time. Those accustomed to working for political figures surely had to adapt their styles if they wanted to be successful working for President Eisenhower. So how did you adapt yours working for President Trump?
Yeah, well, it's important, first of all, to recognize you need to adapt to whoever whoever the president is in this case, or, you know, your commander if you're a senior staff officer in the Army or something, because, you know, you have to help that commander, in this case, the president, succeed. And I knew that I was not going to convince, you know, a man in his, you know, in the 70s to change fundamentally, you know, and to read long briefings or to sit through long briefings. I mean, that wasn't his style. He was a conversational learner. You know, he wanted to see graphs and statistics and so forth. And he actually asked implicit questions that I think were fundamentally sound. Really, from my interactions with him over time, and this is what I told my staff, I said, everything we send to the president, everything we prepare for the president has to answer these questions. And it would be, so what? Why do we care, right? So what he was asking is, what vital interests are at stake, right? Then he would ask, you know, why do we have to do it? Because burden sharing was always on his mind, right? He thought that there were too many free riders internationally on the largesse of American taxpayers. That's one of his big themes. The third was like, why can't somebody else do it? You know, which is related to the others. You know, how much does it cost, and can we drive down the cost? Right? You can kind of think like a real estate developer looking at national security and asking these questions. So I had to sort of morph a lot of what we were providing him. So I was answering his questions and then helping him evolve his understanding of these challenges, so he was armed to make the best decision, best prepared to make the best decision, and to make his own decision. Another answer to that is really what I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of multiple options. I insisted that we provide the president with multiple options. First of all, because he was the president, he got elected. We shouldn't just have him just rubber stamp whatever the cabinet comes up with or the National Security Council. And also, it's in the examination of those different options that you can draw out long-term costs and consequences, compare them to one another. And so I think that's another way to do it. Another way is he was kind of, as I mentioned, a conversational learner. So whereas some members of the cabinet, and I write about the tensions here, my relationships with them some of them were less than harmonious. And part of the tension between us was that some members of the cabinet they kind of viewed Donald Trump as a danger to be contained, right? And they thought the best way to do that would be to mete out certain information to him, right? So they could maybe, bias him in favor of certain decisions, or maybe not to get him make a decision at all, so they could run foreign policy on their own, basically. And I've fought against that by trying to get more voices to the president. I give an example in the book about, as he was evolving his understanding of what was at stake in Afghanistan, I called my friend, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford. That guy is a fantastic officer, true professional in the tradition of George Marshall. And I said, hey, the president likes to learn this way. I was talking to the vice president about it, actually. It was Vice President Pence's idea. He said, hey, he likes to talk to a range of people, get people in who have a lot of Afghanistan experience to talk with them. And so the president had lunch with them. He heard much different perspective that challenged a lot of his predilections. We did the same with senior intelligence officers and so forth. That's another way, but ultimately, what I would try to do is ask him to approve objectives first. Do you agree that this is what we want to achieve? And then in every subsequent conversation, if an idea comes up, instead of saying, well, that's just crazy, you could say, well, how does this relate to our objectives, right? Or could there be other ways to meet these objectives? And then also with President Trump, there's a saying a journalist had about him, which I think is pretty true, that those who are vehemently opposed to Trump take him literally, but not seriously. Those who are the biggest fans of President Trump, right, take him seriously, but not literally, and so, of course, he would say outlandish things. Some of them were so outlandish, I left them out of the book, because they were, but he would think out loud. But some things he would say, for example, like Mark Esper in his book, who's a fantastic guy too, he was rocked back when President Trump said to him something I had heard him say many times about the drug labs in Mexico. Why don't we just bomb the drug labs in Mexico? But I took that as, hey, we need to do something different. Fentanyl is killing 60,000 Americans at that time, now more, a year, right? And so what we're doing is not working. So he was actually asking us to bring him some different options, So anyway, I think that you have to understand the person you're serving as best you can, and and I tried to understand him, and then give him what he needs to make the best decisions, and that's like the story in the book is in part about the president's character, how the president's character helps him be disruptive, and there's a lot of things that need to be disrupted, but how the president's character also makes him so disruptive that he disrupts himself, and sometimes becomes the antagonist in his own story. And anybody who's been following President Trump I'm sure is not surprised by that.
As you do, I spend a lot of time with college students, some of whom are with us tonight from Chapman University, where you spent some time earlier today. At least a few have expressed an interest in serving in the military in the future. What do you think will be different about their experience in the military than what you experienced at their age?
Well, I think there'll be differences and there'll be similarities, right? I think the differences will often come along with the challenges that we're facing internationally and where the greatest threats are. I had the privilege of addressing the cadets at West Point just a few months ago before the summer, at the very last couple of weeks of the academic year last year. And I told them that they had to make sure that their head was in the game, and to make sure that when they go into the Army as lieutenants, they make their part of the Army as best it can be, right? That's a mission that doesn't change. It's your responsibility as a leader, as an officer, to ensure that no soldier ever dies in combat because they didn't have the proper training, or you didn't set high enough standards of discipline, and you didn't challenge your unit to get better every day. So that doesn't change. And also I told them that, any failures of leadership that you encounter in the military, or breakdowns when they do occur, they usually occur because leaders failed to lead. They opted out of their leadership responsibilities. So I told them, as a new lieutenant, when you come in, you're not going to know everything, for sure. Your sergeants are going to know a heck of a lot more than you. But what you have to do is communicate to your sergeants that you want to learn from them, and mature your understanding of maybe particular weapon systems, the employment of those weapon systems, whatever it is. But you are not going to shirk your responsibility. You want to be the one who's responsible for the combat readiness, the discipline, the morale, the welfare of that platoon and the soldiers in your platoon. That doesn't change. What does change, I think, are the conditions of combat, the conditions of battle, the types of challenges that you will face. And what we're seeing, I think, today is an evolution of the character of warfare. The nature of war doesn't change, right? There's a great book called The Face of Battle by John Keegan. And he wrote about battles that occurred across 5 centuries in the same geographic area in Belgium. From the 100 Years' War all the way up to World War I. And so a lot of the book is about changes in the character of warfare. But in the end, what he stresses is continuity. And he says what battles have in common is human. The struggle of men and women trying to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation with the achievement of some aim over which others are trying to kill them. So he says that battle is always aimed at the disintegration of human groups. I think that's true today as it was back in the 100 Years' War. And so it's really important for you as a leader to prepare your unit for the physical, the mental, the psychological, and the emotional challenges of combat. That doesn't change. But what we're seeing is our new threats, the ubiquity of drones, satellite imagery, which I think is moving battle toward a condition in which all organizations will have to act like they're in visual range of the enemy. You have not really a new kind of warfare. You have a new form of warfare that's grafted on old forms of warfare. That's why some of what you see in Ukraine looks like World War I. Some of it looks like World War II maneuver. Some of it looks like something different. And the other important thing is that I think you have to just emphasize always the importance of the initiative. I have a letter, if anybody's going into the military as a junior officer, I'd love to send you to all my new lieutenants that came into our regiment. And one of the things I wrote in that letter is the only excuse for failure that is completely unacceptable is that you were waiting for orders. And so what you need to do is instill your organization with a sense of the initiative and to take risk, because the riskiest course of action in battle is to be risk averse oftentimes. And because that creates opportunities for your enemy, right? So if you sting somebody with your jab, you want the right to come right away. You don't want to delay that and ponder whether or not you should throw your right. You should throw the right, and I think that's another big element of continuity.
Of course, the story you tell in this book is not about your military career, but about your time as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, or simply National Security Advisor. What would you say is different about that role today, as opposed to, say, the time period covered in your first book, Dereliction of Duty, about Vietnam-era decision-making?
Well, I think what's unique about the job as National Security Advisor is there's not a lot of enduring, guidance, right, for the job and how the policymaking process is run. And so that policymaking process is going to reflect, I think, maybe the experience of the National Security Advisor, but probably most importantly, the President and the kind of policymaking, decision-making process the President prefers. So, of course, probably it depends on the President, and the President's evolved their experience over time. Harry Truman, right, for example, when NSC 68 came out and the position of the National Security Advisor, or really the executive secretary, was established in the late 1940s, he was a real skeptic. He's like, why do I need that? I don't need this thing. You know, what is this? But then the Korean War started, and he realized, wow, I really do need this, because we need to integrate efforts across all the departments and agencies in wartime. And we have to integrate economic policy with military policy and foreign policy and intelligence. And so Truman became a fan. He began to sit in NSC meetings and use the NSC. President Eisenhower was much more comfortable with a more formalistic decision-making process, and he brought in Andrew Goodpaster, who is one of the, I think, unsung heroes of the Cold War, the post-World War II period, who had worked for General Eisenhower in Europe, and then became, kind of a pseudo-national security advisor, not really officially that term yet, that title. And then it evolved over time with different presidents. And what I tried to do with President Trump is run the process in a way that got him best analysis, best understanding, and multiple options, so he could make the best decisions. And then I would craft the interactions with President Trump based on what the topic was, the nature of that decision, and who needed to be in the room. Some of the decisions were more conducive to like an informal discussion in the Oval Office with 3 people or 4 people. Sometimes because of classification, you can only have 2 people in there. Some issues were best done in a formal setting. So I remember, and I write about a discussion with the President's Chief of Staff and another advisor about a decision we're going to ask President Trump to take about striking the Khan Shaykhun airfield after the Syrians used chemical weapons, nerve gas, to commit mass murder of hundreds of civilians, including scores of children. And the Chief of Staff's like, oh, we should just do it right here in the Oval Office. And Vice President, he whispered in my ear, he goes, hey, this should go in the Situation Room, just because it communicates, hey, this is a big decision. We all need to be around the table. It has to be more formal. And so that's what we did on the decision on the South Asia strategy, which is the way ahead for Afghanistan, was included in that. We went to Camp David to get away from all the distractions. So that was the best venue. So I think one of the things you do as a national security advisor is obviously the substance, and delivering that substance through an effective process, but also, kind of, not like you're a wedding planner or something, but also worried about the venue, to make sure the venue matches that kind of discussion.
Well, the next question comes by way of a certain 10-year-old girl, our daughter Ava, who perked up when I mentioned that presumably you spent time in the Fort Hood area in the course of your military career, where we lived for a number of years and where she was born. This one is sure to stump you. I hope no state secrets are revealed here. She asks, what was the favorite place you served or visited in your career, and what was the most memorable food you ate?
As you can tell, I didn't cut back on the food, I loved every assignment we had. My wife Katie's here too, and even even in the assignments that you think may not be the ideal assignment, like Fort Irwin, California, right, 40 miles north of the cultural center of Barstow, right? I mean, so you're in the middle of nowhere, and you're on that 40-mile drive with your wife, and she's looking at like, what are you doing to us? Where are you taking us? That was a great assignment. We had a great community there. My job was to be like the enemy for the Army. How cool was that? I get to fight battles all the time, And then we had a predictable schedule and 4-day weekends. I could see my in-laws who were here, every 4-day weekend, or we went down to San Diego quite a bit. We spent a lot of time on Coronado at the Navy Inn and so forth. So that was a great assignment. Our kids loved the area. We met other great kids and walked to school, and it was just a cool place to be, It was great to go back to my alma mater at West Point. It was better to be there as faculty than a cadet in some cases, we enjoyed that. I love living in the UK, in Germany. Maybe my favorite food would be in Germany, I guess, I love European food overall. I love the food. The best place for me is Strasbourg, France, because you get great German and French food, but German portions, not these little tiny French portions, And you got great French wine, you have great German beer. It's like it's the best place to be.
We have time for one more question, perhaps. So finally, the final question looks at the future, not a usual subject of concern for a historian. Looking ahead to Election Day and ultimately January 20th, when someone is going to be sworn in, what can those who work for the 47th president learn from your experience working for the 45th?
Well, that's a great question. That's why I wrote the book. You know, I wrote the book because I felt a duty as a historian, because I believed, you know, this is like predictable for two historians to tell you history is important, right? You know, so I really wanted to capture the experience so it would benefit others. And I think what's most important about the book is how important it is to achieve a high level of strategic competence. And that strategic competence is based on a complete understanding, as you can get, understanding that the world's an uncertain place, an unpredictable place, of the most significant challenges you're facing, and then to really drive actions that promote American security, prevent conflict, in this case now these days, to restore peace, because we have the first major war in Europe since World War II going on, and we have a major regional war, I would call it. People don't want to call it that, in the Middle East, that is, I think, a war that is being driven by the Iranians, who have been able to do so largely with impunity, and have the Arab world enmeshed in a sectarian civil war so they can extend their hegemonic influence with the ultimate objective of kicking us out of the region as the precondition, the precursor for the destruction of Israel, you know, and the killing of all the Jews. That's what they really want to do. They really want to do it. So I think that's an extremely dangerous situation as they race toward a nuclear weapon as well. I believe that these crises that we've seen cascade, I think, from Europe into the Middle East, could cascade further into the Indo-Pacific region, where China is becoming very aggressive at the moment. They've been ramming the ships of our treaty ally in the Philippines, and just a few days ago, they violated Japanese airspace for the first time ever. And this fits a broader pattern of aggressive activity. I think what is provocative, and this would be the lesson, and there's a chapter title, one of the chapter titles is Weakness is Provocative. And I think a lot of Americans become self-referential. I call it, in my previous book, Battlegrounds, strategic narcissism. You tend to define the world only in relation to you and assume that what you do or decide not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And what that does is it ignores the agency, the influence, and the authorship over the future that the other has. The other being especially your adversaries, enemies, and rivals. And I believe that Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and Ayatollah Khamenei all have aspirations in mind and objectives in mind that go far beyond anything that is in reaction to us. And until we stop acting like it's us, and that there's a problem with Iran, and I think the Biden administration has defined it as kind of like a 50-50 problem. No, they're the problem. The Iranians are the problem. And so I think we through a mantra these days of de-escalation, right, and lowering the temperature. You know what that means? That means our adversaries can play all offense and no defense, right? Because we're not imposing any costs on them. Iran is willing, for example, to expend every Arab life and every Palestinian life in its effort to kick us out of the region and destroy Israel. And so we have to stop the de-escalation, recognize that we need a higher dose of strategic empathy to see these challenges from their perspective, and act accordingly, because I do believe that this period that we're coming into, the period of an election where we're going to be at each other, and there's this terribly vitriolic, partisan discourse is going to happen, attacks on both sides. That's going to appear weak to these outside world, these authoritarian regimes who don't really understand democracy anyway. They fear democracy, but they think it's weak rather than resilient. That democracy is weak rather than resilient. And then I think that gap in between the election and the inauguration is very dangerous. And especially, and I don't mean this to be mean or partisan or anything, but we have a president who has very significantly diminished mental capacity. And the whole world knows that now. They hid it for a long time, the people around him. They can't hide it anymore. So if you're an enemy of the United States, when is the time to act? And I think we're in a very dangerous period, And I think it really, all of us should do everything we can to portray strength and resolve in this period of time.
Well, Luke, General, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. And I do want to get into some questions from the audience. So what I'll ask you to do is raise your hand. I'll get to as many as I can. But before I come to you all in this room, I don't want to neglect our friends watching online. So I will take the first one from some of the folks watching on X. And the question is, I'm curious what the general's most significant learning experience in his career was.
Wow. Okay, so I can't select any single experience, but I'll talk about a series of experiences that was extremely beneficial to me. I already mentioned grad school, writing about the book, how that helped me for the job as National Security Advisor. And I would just say that I left a fellowship at Stanford from 2002 to 2003 to deploy forward to the Middle East and to serve as initially the deputy commander's advisory group, initially the executive officer, but then commander's advisory group for Central Command, in the Central Command Forward Headquarters in Doha, Qatar. I traveled as, the so-called advisor for the Central Command Commander, General Abizaid, throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, and went, a couple times a week, it seemed, to Iraq and Afghanistan. And that gave me a tremendous education that I could then apply to prepare a cavalry regiment to deploy and fight in Iraq. And so I had seen every single brigade, every single division in the fight in Iraq, for example. I had seen best practices and not so good practices, what worked, what didn't work. I gained an understanding of the nature of the evolving insurgency in Iraq. And that allowed me, I think, to prepare, and our leaders, to prepare our regiment well and to have a successful combat mission in Iraq, in South Baghdad initially, and then in Nineveh province. But you can learn a lot of things. You tend to think, well, you can learn from your seniors. Certainly that's the case, right? Mentor-mentee relationship. But you can learn a lot from your contemporaries, which I was doing that year. I was learning a ton. There was a guy named Colonel Jim Hickey, who was in Tikrit, which was Saddam's birthplace. And that brigade did a fantastic job. And largely what we did with our regiment was modeled on the success of that brigade and others, picking best practices from a number of different brigades.
All right, our first question from the audience in the room. You, sir.
Hey, good evening, General. I'm retired Commander Bill Lauper. I'm the Senior Naval Science Instructor for Troy High School Navy JROTC here in Fullerton. You mentioned that the character of battle hasn't really changed. My question concerns whether the character of service has changed. With the recruiting issues that most of the services have experienced over the last several years, and a lot of the comments made by different people on each side about the character of service and the character of our military, how does that affect recruiting, and what can we do as a nation to bring back that honor, that patriotic duty of serving our nation?
Wow. Okay, I think the first thing we could do is more people like you in junior ROTC positions, Because I think there are a number of reasons for this. And I wrote about this in an essay a couple of years ago called Preserving the Warrior Ethos. And in it, I talked about how popular culture cheapens and coarsens the warrior ethos, and what you're talking about is the ethic of service and the ethic of service in the military, right? Hollywood, video games, tell people nothing about why servicemen and women serve their country. And they also don't really examine in any way or explain the tremendous rewards of service, right? All of the, the kind of sacrifices and the hardships of service, those are readily apparent to people. And they're also readily apparent to people with the advertising of some good organizations, right? Who portray veterans who have had challenges and want you to contribute to a good cause. But what that has created, I think, is an impression that all veterans are traumatized, fragile human beings. When in my experience, those who go through even the most harrowing combat experiences tend to come out of those experiences stronger. And then, of course, we all know veterans, I hope, who have gone on to make tremendous contributions to our society in other walks of life after the service. So it's a misunderstanding of what animates those who fight and serve in our name. It is a lack of understanding of the rewards of service. Now, add on to that, I think, efforts on the fringes maybe of both political parties to politicize the military. After the January 6th assault on the Capitol, what did you hear? You heard that veterans were overrepresented. That was not true. The fact is, veterans were not overrepresented in those who assaulted the Capitol. But the administration came in, when the Biden administration came in, many of them said in their congressional testimony that they have come in to stamp out white supremacy, direct quote, in the military. I mean, I was in the Army for 34 years. I didn't see white supremacy anywhere. Now, we're imperfect as an organization. You have people who come into the military who might be bigoted or racist or sexist, but the military culture is fundamentally intolerant of bigotry, racism, any sense of that, because it is destructive to the cohesion that is essential for combat effectiveness. So these efforts to change the culture, I think, have bled over as well into efforts to bring into the military some of the various reified philosophies and theories that have destroyed academia in many cases and been in trouble in our universities. And I'm talking about really postmodernist, post-colonial interpretations of history, as well as various critical theories that teach people that victimhood is the new valor, and that you should categorize people into categories of oppressor and oppressed, right? Or to say that you should have equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. And this is kind of the DEI orthodoxy. I mean, all of that to me is nonsense, first of all, but it's destructive. I mean, it's destructive to unit cohesion. Now, those efforts have not succeeded. Military service today is the military service that we had. It's rewarding. Units don't buy into that orthodoxy. They do judge the man or woman next to them based on their courage, right? Their toughness, their sense of honor. They're willing to sacrifice for one another in the country. That's how you should evaluate the soldier, sailor, airman, marine, guardian next to you, right? That's how you should do it. And so the military's not bought into that. But there's been a reaction on the far right from those who have this narrative that the military is woke, right? And this is the kind of Tucker Carlson nonsense, okay, who has become a useful idiot for Vladimir Putin, among other things. So, I don't know if you saw this history interview he just gave, where he, to a Holocaust denier, and somebody who said that Churchill was more dangerous than, I mean, just stop, please, everybody, tune that lunatic out, right? So, but he's been a propagator of that narrative, the military's woke. Hey, the military's not woke. The military's not extremist. And I think the message to politicians, to these people who are charlatans, should be: don't try to drag the military into the destructive vortex of political political partisanship. I think the Area 60 thing that President Trump did was unconscionable. Why would you do a photo op among the most recent war dead? And then, but remember, President Biden in April 2017 announced the complete withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan from Area 60, where our servicemen and women gave their lives in Afghanistan. And what's crazy about that to me is he thought that would play well, even with veterans. So it just kind of shows you the disconnect between our senior political leaders, in this case, one of both parties, and an understanding of the warrior ethos, the professional military ethic. And a lot of it is, such a smaller percentage serve now. Not enough people know enough people in the military. But I think we all have to work together. Chapman's program, for example, this library, what you're doing, Junior RTC, is so important, to help young men and women understand the rewards of service and understand our military and why, the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry to go on about this. Another contributing factor is what I would call the curriculum of self-loathing in our universities. And what has happened is in recent years, there has been a dominant strain, an orthodoxy of an interpretation of history that has become dominant in many of the humanities departments, including history departments. And that is essentially the post-colonial interpretation of history. I'm going to be very general here, but all the ills of the world prior to 45 were due to colonialism. All the ills of the world after 1945 were due to capitalist imperialism. This is the same kind of neo-Marxist approach to history that Charles and Mary Beard took in the 40s. It's always been there. William Appleman Williams to a certain extent. I mean, that's okay with me. Teach that. But don't teach it as an orthodoxy, and don't manipulate history into something like the 1619 Project, which puts forward the false interpretation that our country was founded to preserve slavery. Did our country have the blight of slavery on it for the first 100 years? Yes. Was it imperfect founding because of the criminal institution of slavery? Yes, but our country was founded on principles that ultimately made that criminal institution untenable. We fought the most destructive war in our history to emancipate 1 million of our fellow Americans. Now, we had the failure then after that of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan. It took a long evolution to get to the civil rights movement and the ending of at least de jure inequality of opportunity. But does de facto inequality of opportunity still exist? Yes, it does, right? It still matters what zip code you're born in, in terms of how many obstacles you have to overcome to take advantage of the great promise of this country. So if that's the case, let's do something about that. But don't teach that that your country is founded on principles to perpetuate that inequality. Because if you teach our young people that their country is not worth defending, who's going to defend you, right? Who's going to defend you? So I think that's part of it as well.
All right, we are tight on time, so we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to jump into a book signing. Sir, what is your question?
So, Richard Downey, I'm the president of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. Sir, thank you for a fascinating discussion. This has been absolutely terrific, although I have to say that your answer to the last question is my favorite. That was really good. While you were the National Security Advisor, your job was essentially to assess what was going on in the world and to provide options to the president for what to do about it. I wonder, you talked a little bit about the Middle East, but could you talk a little about how you would assess what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now? I mean, we want to support Israel, but terrible things are happening to Palestinians. The hostages have just been killed recently. It looks like things are just going to continue on. Could you talk about your analysis and assessment, the options you would offer the president today?
Okay, all right, so I think it is right to press Israel to apply firepower with discipline and discrimination and reduce civilian casualties as much as possible. But I think fundamentally what is missing in much of the public discourse is an understanding that Hamas wanted this outcome. Hamas deliberately incited the actions that became necessary after October 7th, in large measure, to get as many Palestinians killed as they could, really. It's in their public statements. They wanted martyrs. I think you have to look at the degree to which they've used the civilian population as human shields. UN facilities, schools, hospitals. One of the reasons why collateral damage, the death of innocents is high, is because wherever there's a safe area that the IDF establishes, and this has not been reported enough, the Hamas leadership moves right into that safe area and continues to operate. And so if you ask the question, how many civilians are given shelter in the vast tunnel network that Hamas has created and diverted the assistance that was meant for the Palestinian people into that terrorist infrastructure, the answer to that question is zero, right? And so then it comes down to what you've heard as the conventional wisdom of our advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's got his issues, believe me. That coalition government has its issues. The Israeli people understand that with the judicial reform effort and the backlash, and you see what's happening now. But I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu is right that Hamas must be destroyed as a military organization. And I don't think there's any way around it, because the same people who said there should be a ceasefire, which would leave Hamas with a military capability, are the same people, which I agree with this objective. Hey, how do we get back to a path toward enduring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? How do we get and begin to envision, at least, a two-state solution? Well, you know who's not signed up for a two-state solution? Hamas. It's in their charter to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That doesn't sound like a two-state solution to me, right? And so as long as Hamas has guns, you cannot see any progress for the Palestinian people or progress toward peace. Because if you say, oh yeah, I'll be the mayor of Gaza, guess what happens next? You get a bullet in the head. And so if there's going to be space for a new political order to emerge, there has to be a security infrastructure in Gaza that is not Hamas. It'll probably have to be an international one, of some kind, and I know that Secretary Blinken and others are working on this. But that has to be a real peace enforcement mission rather than like the weak UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. They have to be able to go after Hamas when they come back in, which they'll try to come back in. And so this is going to take a long time. I mean, Hamas has been in charge since what, 2006? 2006, I think, when they took over. And they've been in charge, and they've kept the population, under their control, and they've fomented hatred among the young people there with all sorts of brainwashing and everything else. So anyway, I just think my answer is much different from what you would hear, I think, typically in the media these days. I think Hamas must be destroyed. I don't think Israel has any other option. Sinwar is still alive. He needs to be hunted down and killed or captured. And then there has to be something on the back end that allows a non-Hamas entity in Gaza to begin to move towards some kind of peace, restoration of the basic economy and functioning and humanitarian assistance. My experience has been, whenever you deliver humanitarian assistance to an area that's controlled by a terrorist, you might as well just write the check directly to the terrorist organization and cut out the middleman, because it's going to get captured by them and used by them. It's sad, but it's really a fact. And this is why I think it's a big mistake for us to, even though it's terrible, the situation in Afghanistan, to send any kind of humanitarian assistance through the Taliban, for example. We did this for a long time in Afghanistan. Reconstruction projects in Taliban-controlled areas. I mean, again, all that does is enrich them, allow them to become even more lethal, and to inflict even more harm on their own population.
General McMaster, Dr. Nichter, thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. He will be up in our front lobby to sign copies of his book. Pick up an additional one in our museum store. Makes a great gift. We'll see you up there. Thank you very much. Have a good night.